At this point have seen me, but I'm Alicia. I'm the TA for this course, and then Matt isn't here today, so I'll be taking over. So today's we're going to do an intro to symmetric crypto. So it's going to be probably one of the most. There's going to be a lot of important things going on, so definitely let me know if you guys have any questions about anything. But then first of all, I know Matt usually likes to start with news. So does anyone have any things that they saw over the weekend that they want to share? Come on, lots of stuff happened. I mean, so I saw a couple of Piazza articles. Did the people who post those want to talk at all about them? But I'm more than happy.
Yeah, I mean, there was something that it's like a week old. It's how the Argentinian Equifax office, their site had employee login, admin, and like login password was admin, login was admin, and the credentials were saved in a plain text file on the head of security desktop.
No matter what types of stuff that we actually try teaching you guys in courses like this, it seems like all these companies that actually do important things that you'd hope to not just have your stuff saved in plain text files, do it anyway. So yeah, that's Equifax is just a never-ending gift of poor choices. Yeah.
I wasn't reading the Equifax special soft website name.
Oh, sure.
It was like Equifax Security 2017 or something, and then so someone came along and then switched security and Equifax, and then somehow by accident, Equifax's Twitter account posted the fake website.
9 times.
I thought it was 3.
It was 9 times. They deleted all of them, but
Amazing.
one good phishing mistake.
Okay, and then did any of you guys? So I saw someone share the Leaky X vulnerability on Piazza. Did all of you guys check that out? Yeah, that was another pretty just another just absurd mistake. Basically, the fact that they just assumed once you form a handshake with some server, it's good to go. So you can just send your username, password, in the clear to it. So that was definitely not one of the most exciting things to hear if you use an Exchange server. And then I thought, the article you shared, I liked how it brought up the fact that attackers could theoretically send some type of phishing campaign to basically get people to update the servers that they're using, and just kind of count on the fact that people suck at typing. So you just get domains that have similar names to the server, and then just wait as people misspell, connect to those ones, send you their credentials, and then basically it's just another mess.
And that's been around as long as the internet, right?
Yeah. So, but yeah, no, it's crazy that it takes this long to kind of hear about these things, where you'd assume that if you were working in a somewhat sane environment, that things like that would be escalated immediately, and you just know this is clearly not the way you want to do things. But what can you do? Yeah. Okay, and then obviously the other interesting thing I've seen is just the I mean, it's not that exciting, the whole Adobe PGP thing, where it's just like a funny issue, but obviously it's not actually that big of a deal, where it seems like it was just someone's email PGP. Yeah.
One question I have is regarding WebAssembly. So with the advent of more tailored, assembled closer to the metal code being run from browsers, what is there to prevent arbitrary code from being executed in that way? Whereas it's a little bit, instead of JavaScript code or something like that, you're actually working down at the binary level, feeding the process.
That's a good question. So I actually personally haven't looked that much into WebAssembly, so I don't have a great answer for you, but definitely, hopefully that's something. I'm actually curious, so that's something I'll definitely check out. But hopefully someone out there in the project's let's make sure that there's some type of constrained environment where you're not just able to run whatever you want. Yeah, that's something worth checking out. So I guess if no one has any other things to share, we can just jump right into it. So basically, up till this point, so this is basically just the roadmap of everything we've done. So we've kind of looked at crypto from its early days, you know, the Caesar cipher and all of that fun stuff, and then kind of moving forward to, I don't know if you talked in detail about the Enigma machine and all that, but that's also kind of like one step on this way. And then we had this idea of one-time pads, these perfectly secure encryption schemes, but obviously not necessarily easy to bring into the real world. And then past that, we had block ciphers, and with block ciphers, you get modes of operation, and then I think in counter mode, he kind of discussed how you can almost use that as a close way to get to a one-time pad, where you basically have this, you use the counter mode to generate a unpredictable stream of characters for your key, and then you just XOR those with your actual plain text. So hopefully, assuming that the mode itself is secure, that should give you a pretty solid stream cipher. And then finally, we briefly touched on authenticated encryption. So that's basically the idea that we want to have things encrypted, but we also want to make sure that when we decrypt them, they look the same as when they were encrypted. No one's messed with them. So how do we actually enforce that, right? So today's kind of game plan is we're just going to recap authenticated encryption real quick, the padded oracle attack. Oh crap, what does that mean? And then I'm going to introduce to you real quick this new kind of security notion, IND-CCA2, which is known as adaptive indistinguishability under chosen ciphertext attack. So we're just going to be going really high level over it. I will give a bit more details in my review session, just kind of give you a bit more intuition of what exactly it's all about, but you don't really need to know too much about it, just kind of the fact that it exists and why it was devised. And then finally, the core idea today is asymmetric cryptography, where kind of this question that leads us into this is how to kind of create a secure channel for communication. And we're going to kind of formalize this notion of what I mean when I say secure channel. But okay, so going over, so in terms of authentication, so we have this idea of malleability, which is that, sure, you've encrypted some data, but maybe it's encrypted in a way that if the attacker knows what it looks like. So I guess a common example is, say the messages you're sending are attack at dawn or attack at midnight, or like the British are coming by sea versus land. Maybe you know that that's kind of the format of the message. So then, depending on how it's encrypted, maybe you can mess around with the ciphertext so that it decrypts to a different message, and that could obviously pose pretty serious issues. And so some of these modes we've talked about are like they're not the best in terms of their protections. So that's why we want to add in this new thing, authenticated encryption, which the key primitive is. Someone check that out, please, if you guys remember. How do you bring in authentication, kind of? It's a 3-letter, yeah, MAC, message authentication code. So, and then also I'm going to probably real briefly kind of give an example of how CBC mode is malleable when I go over the padded oracle attack, just because that's something that's useful to know for assignment 2. So yeah, so authenticated encryption, the model obviously is that we have a channel, but there's an adversary inside of the channel that can kind of see everything and also act on the messages within the channel, which is, so in that space, how do we make sure that despite that adversary, we can push messages through this channel and know if they've been changed or not. So yeah, so basically, as we've talked about, we have these things called MACs. They're a keyed symmetric key primitive, which means that the key is shared between the sender and the receiver. And the idea is that if you have the key and you know the message, you should be able to compute it. So it's pretty easy to verify that. And then obviously the flip side of that is if you don't have the key, then you shouldn't be able to create a valid MAC. So only the sender and the receiver will be able to assess or produce valid MACs. And then, but when we're using this, there's kind of this key rule that there is, which is that we want to encrypt our messages first and then authenticate them. So does anyone, obviously the reason is to prevent malleability, but does anyone know why it's very important that it happens in that order? So basically it's because if you say did it the flip side, so you computed a tag of the message first, and then you encrypted it, then say the adversary has, for example, say they have a bit more power than we expect, that they can, maybe they know the key that the MACs are composed under, but not necessarily the encryption key. Then what they could do is they could mess the message up and also fix up the MAC. So then you actually, is that too powerful? But yeah, so basically the idea is that if you're when you're the receiver and you receive the message, if the first thing you're doing is decrypting the message and then only after you've decrypted it that you're assessing whether it's authentic or not, that's a bit too late in the game. You generally want to make sure that's the first thing that you know, that this message has not been changed, and then you actually care about what the contents of the message are. So yeah, so that's like that order is pretty important. And then another thing that's generally a good practice is to use different keys for the encryption stage and the MAC stage. So that's just kind of make sure that if one's compromised, the whole, like you still have some security remaining. And then, so this is another security definition that I think you guys have kind of been introduced to, but I plan to go into the details of and kind of show you an example that does and doesn't fit into it during the review session. Because that's not necessarily the most, like, you don't necessarily need to know the full details, but having that background is definitely useful in understanding how it's used. So yeah, so that's existential unforgeability, which kind of boils down to this idea that you need the key to create correct MACs, and that you shouldn't be able to generate two valid MACs for one message. And then the examples we've seen are HMAC, which we usually use hash functions to build, and then there's also this other way to do things called CMAC or CDC MAC, where you actually can use CDC mode of a block cipher to produce a MAC. So then yeah, and then basically, so there's this generic, using encryption algorithm and a separate authentication algorithm, combine them. But then there are some schemes that actually have them both mixed together. So that's just, you don't necessarily need to know the details of how those work, just kind of the fact that they exist, that there is more than one way to kind of do that. Okay, so in terms of the assignment 2, part 2, oh, sure.
Are there any, is there any loss of security redundancy somehow by using the same hash function for, or using the same method as for encryption as for your authentication? For example, you could have thrown an AES CDC at our, you could.
Yeah, so basically, so at the end of the day, the two are actually guaranteeing slightly different properties that don't fit well in different cases. Because for a MAC, basically what we kind of want is that we have this idea of unforgeability that basically that it's difficult to have an adversary produce two messages that kind of fit back to the same one. You kind of have this like you have it's not quite a hash function, but it has a similar property where there are multiple possible, like it's not required that there's a unique output, but it's just the fact that finding those is very infeasible, whereas in encryption, you want that there's a very specific, deterministic output to whatever your input is. So there's a bit of a nuance with if you like dig into the details of like the security definitions that define a encryption cipher versus a MAC, but it's kind of when you look into those that you realize that in most cases you can't really fulfill both properties with a single thing. But I mean, there are things that do both, which are these authenticated encryption schemes that kind of are a single unit. Yeah. So anyway, so the padding oracle attack is an important part of assignment 2, part 2. I don't know if it's released yet, but either way, it's still kind of useful, I'm sure, to have an idea. So as far as I understand, you guys have already had an introduction to this idea. This is just going to kind of be a review of the ideas behind the padding oracle attack. But so I just have for reference the encryption and decryption schemes for CBCMAC. But so the idea behind the padding oracle attack is that we're kind of using the decryption function, which we usually model as an oracle, to kind of give us some information about what the actual plain text looks like given only ciphertext. So say we have some, message, and then we have like a tag that's computed with some MAC, and then we have a padding string, which is so using the version we've talked about, it has a bunch of fives because there's 5 strings. 5, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so does anyone remember kind of what the first step is here? So I guess our initial goal is, say we want to, so our end goal kind of is, say we want to figure out what this byte is in the plain text, right? So how do we get there?
We have to guess the length of the pad.
Yeah. So basically, the first step is kind of figuring out how long this padding string is. So one way of doing that is what you do is you take your block of ciphertext and you maul this, the very last byte of it. And generally, if you just kind of maul it, then you have an incorrect thing. So say we create some mask, we XOR it with the last byte, and then this becomes like some crazy other value. It will be confusing if I change it. But basically, you're going to get a padding. You're going to get, like in this case where we have this decryption oracle that kind of lets you know when padding is wrong or when the MAC is poorly formed. When you mess with this byte, if it's not the correct one, you're going to get a padding string error. So then you can kind of iterate through the possible. You're going to go through a list of masks that you kind of maul this last byte with until you figure out kind of what the value of the byte is. And then we'll actually, for padding string, you're going to have to do it over multiple bytes until you kind of suppress this padding string error. And then that will let you know what the padding string is. And then once you have that, you can move on to this next byte. So when you can actually move on to the actual message. So the idea is once you actually get to the message, then what we can do is say we can try shifting all of these to 6, right? So then this is going to raise a padding string error unless this byte in the plain text is also a 6. So then what we can do is apply masks to this byte until we get the padding string error to switch into a MAC error, and then we know that we've actually figured out what this byte is. And then you can kind of iteratively follow that process byte to byte and kind of figure out each of the bytes of the plain text. Right? Does that make sense to everyone? So there's going to still be a bit more to do in this assignment because obviously we're not going to be dealing with individual blocks, but multiple blocks together. So there's still a few other things you kind of have to keep an eye on there. One important thing is with CBC MAC. So as you can see there, the decryption looks like this. We have an IV, and we have XOR C1. So, question for you all. If I mess with a byte of, if say I flip a bit in C1, the first block of the ciphertext, what can you tell me about what the result of M1 is going to be? Yeah, but do you have any notion of how it's going to change? So remember, so we have C1 with a bit flip that's going through a block cipher. So so one of the properties, if you remember, of block ciphers is the idea that they should do something called diffusion, where if you kind of every time you make a small change in the input, it will result in a large change in the output. That multiple bytes will, like, I think on average it should have at least half of the bytes or bits affected for a bit of change in the input. So this M1 will be completely unpredictable if we change a byte, if we flip a bit in C1. But what can you tell me about M2? So we know that C1 has a bit flip.
Everyone's gonna have a bit.
Yeah. So yeah, M2. So we don't know anything about M1, but if we flip a bit in C1, we can get that to result, since the inputs here, so C2 hasn't been changed, so that'll decrypt correctly, and then C1 has only one bit flipped. So when we XOR, we'll get M2, everything as it should be, except with one bit flip, or one byte flip, or sorry, bit, yeah. So that's an example of kind of how you can carefully maul things in CBC mode. So that's something that will be useful to keep in mind kind of when you're working on this assignment. So, does anyone have any questions about padding oracle attacks? Does it all make sense? Are you guys experts? Can you go into the field tomorrow and just attack all the padding oracles? Cool. Well, don't get me or math fired. I guess I'd probably get fired because this is my lecture.
What's the iMessage?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, that's one last thing I wanted to say about padding oracle attacks, which is, so I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Matt's work on, he had this attack a couple of years ago on iMessage. And so I don't think, last year he did an assignment based off of this. I don't think he's going to do that, but if he does, then this might be good to know. But basically, so there was an issue with iMessage where you could use it as a padding oracle attack, but there was basically one kind of thing that iMessage did that made it even worse, which was it used the very beginning of every message was the username that the message was meant to be sent to, and basically that's who iMessage assumed was the receiver of these messages, which kind of which allows you to do a bit more, because then if you are the if you're like the expected receiver of the message, or say like you want messages to come to you instead of someone else, what you can do is you can use this process to not only kind of figure out what the plain text is, but you could actually change the username at the beginning, and then so the messages come to you, and then since they're assumed to be your messages, then you can fix up the MAC also because it will be under a key that's assumed that you have. So it's a good paper. I definitely recommend reading it. That's like a cool recent example of like a padding Oracle tech.
Yeah, and just a little bit off topic, I'm worried about mentioning it. We went on these ciphers and the information is being transmitted end to end or like in sequential order. What about actual scrambling of blocks or like non-linearly delivering information? Does that ever happen?
So the tricky thing there is that like whatever thing you do, the receiver also has to know. So that could either result in two schemes. One where it doesn't really matter then because it's a part of this, it's a part of the protocol, so that like any adversary knows exactly what's going on, so they can just trivially refit everything. Or you could have that as part of the secret, in which case, I don't know. It just seemed like that would be a kind of a difficult kind of like secret property to kind of convey to people. And then yeah, generally the idea behind these is that if you do your encryption correctly, you shouldn't know anything about the contents of the data. So it doesn't really matter what order you receive it in, because each block should, to the adversary, seem like it could contain any message, right? Okay, so now let's talk about secure channels. So when we have this idea, so I guess in like a ideal sense, a secure channel is similar to, say, I want to talk to you, and the way we do that is we have kind of the the whole cup with a string. So it's pretty, and I guess in this case there's no one like tapping into that string. It's just literally a pipe that only me and you have access to and no one else. So that's the ideal, right? But obviously it's not necessarily possible to just like have explicit uneavesdroppable channels every time you want to talk to a different person. So kind of instead we use these cool mathematical properties that we gain from cryptography to build in those ideas that we want into just a general normal connection line. So the first one we kind of want is the fact that things are confidential, that like with basically that there is a channel that exists, that the messages are only known within that channel and not outside of it. And we obtain that through the use of encryption, right? When we encrypt things, we kind of create this virtual channel that it's only within that the message is known, and then anyone outside of that doesn't have any idea about it. And then the other thing we want is that the channel has integrity, that if things are altered in the process of going from sender to receiver, that we know that we realize that. And obviously we get that property through authentication and things like MACs. So today's class is mostly about this third idea, which is we only want certain people to have access to this channel, right? Obviously, I can create a great encryption scheme, but if every single one of you has the same secret key that I'm using, it's not really a secure channel, right? Every single one of you can see and know everything that's happening in it. So we want to make sure that we kind of make this exclusive in some way. And then the fourth property is we want to know that the person on this other side of the channel, so we know that there's only like 2 people that are allowed to be in this channel. Say we can establish that once we solve the third property. But we want to actually know that the guy on the other side is our friend, not just some random person. So that's something that we're going to kind of touch on in this lecture, but then actually get into next week, which is the idea of authentication. And then so this third property is generally known as the key exchange problem. How to get secret information from me to someone else, or for us to jointly agree on some secret without anyone else knowing. But yeah, so basically, so say we have whatever channel we want to use, there's someone sitting there that's listening to everything. So how do we, if we've never really talked to each other, agree that this is the key that we're going to be using for encryption, right? How do we kind of come up with that in a way that we both can learn something from each other, but someone listening in doesn't learn anything from anyone? So we're going to talk about a pretty cool scheme that actually solves this problem in a fairly simple way. But and then basically that protocol that we're going to be using kind of brings us into the next stage of this course, which is moving to asymmetric cryptography, which is the idea that there is no longer just a single key that is used by everyone, that there's kind of this difference between how encryption works and decryption works in terms of the secrets used. And the reason for this is because symmetric crypto, as I just talked about, requires everyone to have a shared key. And it's not an easy problem to solve of like how to get everyone to have that same key without or not everyone, have you and your friend have that key without everyone else knowing what that key is. So that's kind of what prompted this idea of maybe having a single shared key isn't the best way to do things. And similarly, alongside that, as we kind of came up with this idea, we also realized that we might need a new security scheme because both in the symmetric key case, there are some examples, and especially in this asymmetric case, you're going to see that it's basically a given that the adversary can kind of generate or obtain ciphertexts, arbitrary ones and basically just like have these, and then kind of attempt to use them to figure out what your messages are. So we kind of want a scheme that captures that. So what IND-CCA2 security kind of looks at is the idea that you have an adversary that can generate ciphertext, and you have an oracle that will still do decryption, just like in the IND-CPA scheme. And kind of the way it works is you can send all of your ciphertext to this decryption oracle. It'll give you the decryptions, and then you can then decide to actually perform the challenge. So you send 2 messages. The oracle will randomly decide which one to encrypt and send it back to you. And then you can do another round of sending ciphertext to this oracle with the important property that it can't include C, because if you could include C, then this is trivially simple, right? Because you can just send C, have it decrypted, and then you know which message it is. But basically, so then that way you can learn as much as you can about how ciphertexts are decrypted and kind of what that form looks like, and eventually you make a guess. So I guess so the high level thing here is kind of the fact that adversaries being able to produce their own ciphertext requires a new model of security. And so you don't necessarily need to know more than that, but if you want, during my review session, as I said, I'll kind of give you an example of a scheme that is secure in the chosen plaintext setting, but falls apart once we assume this stronger property. Yeah. Okay. But now, so moving into kind of this key exchange problem. Before we can get there, there's just a couple preliminary notions that we have to go through. So I'm going to need all of you guys to put on your math hats for a sec, because we're going to be doing some very, very basic group theory, where I'm assuming at least most of you have probably not done too much or been exposed to groups at all. Okay, don't worry, they're very, very simple. Like, they're scary because they have their own name, but they're actually, you're right here. So, what is a group? So, a group is basically a set and so basically what it is it's a set. So just a collection of elements that can be just arbitrary things. You can like common uses like numbers, right? So whether like any set of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's a set. Has 5 elements, the first 5 integers, and then it has an operation. So just kind of the common just common practice is we denote this as multiplication, but it's just a general operation that that basically acts on the members of the set, and it has a few core properties, which are, first of all, if we have say we have A, B, C, or G, then the key ideas here are, first of all, that it's closed under addition. What that means is that if you add 2 elements of the set, or if you operate on 2 elements of the set, then the result is still in the set. So basically, the first thing is, so So the second idea is that these are that the operation is associative, which basically just means that if we have A, C, this is equal to. So I mean, so this is like a pretty just basic rule of like most operations that you're probably familiar with. And then the next property is that it has a identity element.
Is the operation in like the first bullet point supposed to be the dot?
Here or
Yeah, is it supposed to be a plus or a dot?
so generally they use dot just as like the notion, but it can be kind of anything. Oh, here you mean? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. The example I'm going to use is is going to be addition. So that's why I kind of just got confused. But yeah, so the definition of the identity element is basically if we have an element of this group, and then we operate on like the identity. So let's say the identity is just called like E. Then the result is the same element. So basically, oh, you guys can't see back there? Is that better? Okay, and then we also have an inverse, which the idea is basically, so say if B is the inverse of A, then A times B will be the identity, right? So basically the inverses cancel out and go to the identity.
So is that just an inverse property in general, or is that like every member of the group has an inverse?
So oh yeah, so
that is also in the group.
so every member of the group has an inverse.
That
so
is also in the group? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, well yeah, because all of these kind of come together. Because say we had if every element had an inverse that wasn't in the group, then for example, then we wouldn't necessarily have it wouldn't necessarily be closed under addition then, or closed under the operation. But yeah, so okay, I keep saying addition. So can anyone kind of guess what like a common example of a group that you probably use every day is? Okay, yeah, so that's a group, but we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Can anyone come up with a very, very simple group that you guys probably use? Think about it. It's a group of, it's a collection of elements that can be numbers or whatever. It has an operation.
Real numbers?
Yeah, that's definitely one, but let's stay a bit more simple and do the integers with addition, right? So if you have any two integers and you add them together, you get another integer. If you obviously they have associativity. Each of them has the identity element here, which is 0, or there's one identity element 0, and then everything has an inverse, right? For every integer a, there's a negative a, right? But what about multiplication with the integers?
You don't get the inverse property.
Yeah, yeah, because for example, so in multiplication, the identity would be 1, right? Because 3 times 1 is 3. But what's the inverse of 3? What times 3 equals 1? 1/3, but 1/3 is not an integer, it's a rational number. So that doesn't follow. So then there's also this, okay, so is everyone fine with these 4 properties? So there's also this additional special type of group, which is called an abelian group, which basically adds this one additional property, which is for regular groups, this operation isn't guaranteed to be commutative, which means like basically a plus b, or a times b and b times a aren't guaranteed to be the same value in a generic group. But with abelian groups, that means that that's not the case. That right multiplication and left multiplication result in the same value. So does anyone know an example of, actually, does anyone know, is the integers with addition abelian or not? Yes. Yeah, because yeah, obviously 1 plus 3 and 3 plus 1 both equal 4. Okay, cool. So let's see. Okay, so now that we have all of this, let's jump into slightly more complicated examples. So the one you brought up is a very popular type of group, which is, so it's so what this is it's generally, so it's called the integer, I think the formal name is like the multiplicative group of integers modulo p, or something like that. Basically, the idea is that it's the integers mod some value, which is explicitly denoted, and it has another interesting property of groups that are going to be pretty important for us. So let's just kind of see an example of this. So we have, so let's say we are looking at Z mod 11. So the elements of this are basically just going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right? Because everything here is, oh, sorry. So, and this is under multiplication. So as we said, multiplication with the integers isn't a group, but modular multiplication is, because you have this kind of wraparound, which allows for you to possibly actually like multiply just 2 regular integers, and then their result modulo something might actually be 1. So then they can be actually inverses. And this doesn't include, even though this is the integers, it doesn't include the negative numbers, because those are congruent in modular arithmetic to values here. Yeah?
Aren't you missing 11?
No, because if you're doing something modular, what is 11 mod 11? 0. Oh, so one additional property is this isn't just the values of the integers mod some value. It's also, they also have to have this idea called being relatively prime, which means that they don't share any common factors. So we usually use prime numbers for this value, because that makes this property easy, right? Because prime numbers generally don't share any factors with any values. So then like it has everything. Whereas so I'll give an example of like if we do Z mod 8, how that differs from this set. But and then also we don't include 0 because 0 would kind of break the group property of this because everything times 0 is 0. Yeah, so let's look at, so let's kind of like explore how, what happens if we kind of just like do operations on elements of this group. So like say we have like, so we start with like 2 times 1 mod 11, which is clearly 2. 2 times 2 mod 11, which is 4. And then, yeah, so I'm going to just skip the actual. So basically, I'm just shifting what 2 is being multiplied by. So then this will be 8. And then, since, okay, so then it's going to be larger than 11 now, so we're going to apply the mod. So it's going to be 5, then 10, 7.
Sorry, you lost me there.
Oh, actually, sorry, these, I lied on these. Okay, so this should be 4 now,
Okay, great.
5, 10, 7. Oh, no. Maybe I made this more confusing than you. Okay. And then, yeah, so it'll be right there. 2 times 7 mod 11 equals 3. Okay, so the couple interesting things I kind of want you to notice about this are, first of all, just by kind of multiplying 2 by repeatedly, so like 1 times 2, and then you kind of, you know, just like keep applying the outputs, you realize you've actually kind of gotten every single element in this group just through this operation. So, and also the other thing that we notice is if we keep going, we reach 2, and then obviously the next one's going to be 4, and then 8, and so on. So it repeats. So when you kind of have a group of that structure, where you have some number, some element in the group that if you kind of just repeatedly, so like say, we can almost write this as exponentiation. So we have 2 to the 0, 2 to the 1, 2 to the 2, so on to like, this would be 2 to the 11, or no, yeah, this would be 2 to the 10, and then 2 to the 11. So when we have this property where we have a value that you can kind of just repeatedly multiply to itself and generate all of the elements of a group, then it's called a generator. And especially if, as you keep doing that, it causes the group to repeat, then it's a cyclic group, because it kind of, you can just kind of have these cycles, right, where if you just kept going, you would go through this exact same order, like again and again and again. So, actually, so I guess we don't have, actually no, we have, so like say we have Z8. So in this case, let's see if we have a generator for this. So let's see if repeatedly multiplying something will give us all of the elements of the group. So if we try 1, what does that get you? That always just gets you 1. If we try 2, well, okay, well, we have relatively prime numbers, so 2 wouldn't be in this because 2 is not relatively prime to 8. So that results in an issue, which is you'd get 0 to show up, which is obviously that would kind of make this no longer a group, because then it like multiplication would just always be 0.
You can't divide by 0 because you can't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm sorry because I know this might be a lot to kind of process in one session, but it's just it's not too horrible. It's just kind of like this idea that specifically with this, that you kind of have a value that you can just kind of exponentiate, and it allows you to build the entire group, like every single element, as you kind of go forward. But yeah, so the next element, 3, if you multiply, you get 3, and then you get 1, 5, 5, 1, 7, 7, and 1. So basically, the largest you can get is have something of these 4 values, you can get something that would generate 2 of them, which is why something like Z8, which doesn't have a prime mod, doesn't give you a generator. So that is, yeah.
So you said 1 gives you just 1?
Oh, well, so if you multiply 1 by 1, you get 1, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then if you multiply 1 by 1 again, like if you just keep doing
Oh,
powers,
okay.
whereas with 3, right, so when you multiply 3 by 1, you get 3, but then if you multiply, so then if you multiply 3 by 3, you get 9, which mod 8 is 1, and then you kind of would see the same thing with all of these. Okay, so we have that. So then the last thing that we kind of have to build up, and then we will get into the glory of the actual key exchange, is the discrete log problem. Which is basically if you have group elements, so G and B are part of a group, and say G is the, actually no, so we don't need anything about G, but so basically this problem is kind of solving for this k. So if you have like a group element raised to some integer equaling another group element, how do we figure out what this k is? So it's similar to a regular logarithm, but it has, because it's in the discrete setting, there's actually, for specific types of groups, one of them being this group, the Z modulo group, there isn't any efficient way to compute the discrete log, and especially compared, there's an asymmetry because discrete exponentiation, which you guys may be familiar with or not, is very fast to compute. There's the square and multiply technique, which allows you to compute exponents really fast, but basically not the other way around. And there's actually an interesting thing about modular exponentiation, which you guys would probably talk about in a later lecture, where it actually has a different type of attack that can be done on it when it's used in this other algorithm, RSA. But so all you guys kind of need to know is that this is a problem that is not computationally feasible to compute for large primes. So specifically, if we're using Z mod P, then basically this is hard. And yeah, so that's kind of all you kind of need as our lead into the actual Diffie-Hellman protocol. So here it is. It's probably one of the most important results in crypto, but it's glorifyingly simple. Basically, all that's happening is, so we have G, which is just a publicly known generator for a group. So say we just kind of have agreed on beforehand, there's just like this publicly known generator for our group. So like in this case, like it would be 2 for Z mod 11. Then what we do is we vote kind of, so ignore this Q value, you don't necessarily need to care about that. What we do is we just kind of choose 2 random numbers. So I come up with some A, and my other party would come up with some B, and we keep those secret to ourselves. But what we do share in the channel is we share the generator raised to our number. So I would send g to the a, and obviously this is in the z modulo group, so it would be mod p, and then my other counterparty would send g to the b back to me. So what we then do is, if I have g to the a, if I have a and someone sent me g to the b, right? I can get g to the ab because I can just raise, I can just raise like g to the b to the a, right? And then similarly, the other party with knowing b and receiving g to the a can compute g to the ab. But what about the adversary, right? What do they learn when they just kind of sit on this channel? They learn g to the a and they learn g to the b. But why doesn't that really help them at all?
Do they know P and Q?
You can assume that they know P, and so don't necessarily worry about Q. But yeah, so the group being used is known. So basically, it's because of what we kind of talked about right here, which is that when we're dealing with discrete logs, assuming that the prime we're using is large enough, you can't easily, so g to the a and g to the b by themselves, like if you multiply them, right, that doesn't give you g to the ab, that'll give you g to the a plus b, which is a completely different value. What the adversary would need to do is be able to extract the a and b values so that then they could actually compute g to the ab. But the discrete log problem explains that extracting this a or extracting that b are not computationally feasible for an adversary. It's just too hard of a problem. So, sure.
So this allows both sides to calculate a common number.
Yeah.
How do they communicate that they have the same number?
Well, that's just because like all of this math will be well, okay. Well, there's two parts to your question. So the first part is like if this protocol goes exactly as expected, then they will be guaranteed to have the same number. But I think you might be touching on what the next thing I was going to talk about is, which is what is this protocol not handling? Kind of what's the last piece to this? Which is, so sure, a passive adversary just listening into this doesn't learn what they need to learn to kind of recover the key and decrypt conversations. But what if we didn't have necessarily a passive adversary? What if we actually had someone that would kind of be willing to even talk to Alice and Bob and kind of interact with them? So then we actually see that this protocol does have a weakness in the form of a man-in-the-middle attack, because as I said, right now we're only dealing with the third property, which is we guarantee that if this protocol is engaged, the two parties will have a key that no one else knows, but this doesn't have the fourth property, authentication. So we know we've created a key with someone, but we don't know who exactly that key is with, which is why Mallory could actually do something a bit clever, which is kind of sit in the middle of the conversation and perform the exchange with each party. So each party, so like for Alice, Mallory would pretend to be Bob and act exactly as she would expect from Bob. And similarly for Bob, Mallory would act like Alice. And there's no way that they could know that this, because they don't really know anything else. They don't really have any other secret information with Bob. So they don't have any way of knowing like who exactly is on the other end. They just know that they've engaged in a Diffie-Hellman protocol with someone. So then if Mallory does this, then clearly everything can be decrypted, right? Because it has this key and it has this key. So it can just receive the message, decrypt it, read it, re-encrypt it with the other key, and then send it over. And then no one will necessarily be any the wiser. So that's definitely a serious issue that this protocol has. And as we've talked about, the issue is that we don't have any way of authenticating who the person, well, in what we've built up so far, we don't have any way of authenticating what the person on the other end is. So obviously, how do we solve that? We find a way to authenticate who the other person is. So there are a couple different ways that you can kind of think about this. One is maybe you have some other channel. So maybe this is for like some type of end-to-end text-based messaging service, but you guys also can out of band call each other. So you can kind of do the key exchange, but then call each other up and be like, is this the key you got? And if it's not the same, you know that someone was actively messing with your communication. But the most common way of kind of doing this is what we're leading into, which is kind of like beyond this key exchange idea, the real core and meat of asymmetric cryptography, which is public key infrastructure. So you guys may or may not have seen some stuff related to that. So that's kind of this algorithm RSA, this idea of public keys and private keys, this notion of certificates. That all kind of falls into this idea of public key infrastructure, and it's all kind of the key idea around it is coming up with a way that we actually know who we're engaging with. That there should only, it's not just that there's someone on the other end that we've created a secret with, but that there should only be one possible person that could be, which is the one that we want. So next time we're going to go into, so when Matt is back, he's going to dig into public key crypto. So he's going to talk about encryption algorithms such as RSA, but then also talk about digital signatures. And assignment 2 is due next week. But so we have a bit of time left. So I wanted to, I guess I had like a couple extra things kind of on the topic of Diffie-Hellman to talk to you guys about. So first of all, I don't know if you guys are familiar with another pretty cool paper from a few years back called Logjam, if that rings any bells. So now that you guys actually know about like key exchange and Diffie-Hellman, it's actually pretty exciting because there's a lot of really cool work that's out there that now you guys have like the fundamentals to kind of understand. And one of these big ones is Logjam. So the Diffie-Hellman protocol, like this is one of the key ways on the internet that today that we set up shared secrets between each other. This is used everywhere. But what some researchers, Matt included, found out was that basically there were two things. First of all, that the NSA had an ability to downgrade the primes that people were using in the scheme to export grade 512-bit keys, but then also that people were using pretty, like basically, generally, you kind of want to have like a diversity of different primes that you use, but people were pretty much just for, so slightly bigger primes, 1024-bit, but they were basically only a few different primes used. So what the NSA could easily do based off their calculations is it was small enough that they could just do a bunch of pre-computations and kind of have and build up like kind of a set of discrete logs, so that way when they see something live, they probably have it in their database and they can just very quickly retrieve the like what the kind of way of inverting it is, and then bam, it's decrypted. So basically there are this was a couple years ago, so hopefully there are patches in most places, but yeah, so as of a few years ago, it's basically a given that the NSA could decrypt most web traffic, because they could just kind of force you to downgrade to these weaker primes, or that you whatever tool you were using wasn't using, it was kind of just reusing the same prime again and again, which opened up this way that you could kind of pre-computate and kind of be prepared for when people would use it. So that's one thing. And then one other thing I kind of wanted you guys to think about was, is it fine if I erase this group definition? Everyone has this? Cool. So one other thing I wanted you guys to think about is, so this Diffie-Hellman protocol, so let's put up the simpler version of it, is about if just two parties, Alice and Bob, wanted to set up a shared secret together. But say we had one more party involved. Say we had 3 people that wanted to do something. So we had Alice, we had Bob, and then we also had Charlie, right? So if we just try to naively apply the exact same algorithm, so say we just have like some like central broadcasting point. So B sends out G to the B, C sends out G to the C, A sends out G to the A. Does anyone see a problem here? So obviously, so here our goal is the secret key we want to all use is G to the A, B, C. So if we just kind of naively apply this in this setting, what problem do we run into? So let's look at what A knows. So obviously A knows A. Oh, that's G. A knows A because A, that's the private secret that A randomly picked for itself. And it from here has learned G to the B and G to the C, right? And its goal is to compute G to the ABC. But as we've talked about, we have this discrete log problem, right? So so A knows enough to say compute G to the AB or G to the AC, but it needs to be able to extract one of these exponents from one of these to be able to compute the secret that we want, G to the ABC. So it's not, so this way actually doesn't work. It kind of breaks down because of that. So it's not necessarily, that case just as is isn't necessarily applicable to more than 2 parties. But that's not to say it's not possible. It's just much more complicated. Basically, what you have is we can have A send to B G to the A, right? So then what B does is it sends to C G to the B and G to the AB. So we kind of do this round robin, where then C sends to A, G to the C, and G to the AC. And then finally, G to the BC. And then finally, A also sends G to the AC. So in this way, we can then get everyone to know everything they need to get G to the ABC, and it's still secure from like an eavesdropper. But obviously, this is fairly more complex than the 2-person case, and in fact, like, so this strategy will still work for greater than 3, but there's some additional considerations you have to apply. So just the interesting aside that this Diffie-Hellman protocol works really, really well the way it is for 2 parties, but gets much more complicated with more. Yeah. So there actually is also a way with the simple application to do it with 3 parties, but it involves some like much more complex math. These things called bilinear maps, which we're not even going to ever. You guys will never probably ever hear about them again in this class, but it's just a thing that exists that does allow you to build up this this scheme with more than 2 parties. So yeah, so that's basically mostly what I had. The one parting thing I kind of want you guys to think about is this is a key exchange protocol, correct? So what this is designed for is having 2 people agree on some shared secret. But I want you guys to kind of think, is there some way that you can kind of use this discrete log problem and kind of this protocol that we've seen to kind of twist this from being a key exchange protocol to maybe a encryption protocol? That you could actually use this to encrypt messages and then decrypt them in a way that has, obviously it's an encryption scheme, but then it might also add in some level of authenticity. So that's just something you guys may or may not kind of already have an idea depending on your background in crypto, but think about it. It's a good exercise. And then yeah, that's all I had today.